thank you for joining us today for Bloomreach's Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable. My name is Terezia, and I'll be hosting our event today. And I'm joined by Rob Garf, VP and General Manager for Retail at Salesforce. Hi, Rob.
Hello there.
And then we also have Brian Walker, Chief Strategy Officer at Bloomreach. Hi, Brian, and thank you both for being here today. So for those of you who have joined us at Commerce Pulse before, welcome back. For those of you joining us here for the first time, Commerce Pulse is a quarterly event that highlights data we gather here at Bloomreach, where we power e-commerce experiences for hundreds of businesses around the world. So with the help of our lovely panelists, we put those numbers into context, providing us all with a better understanding of the state of commerce today and what we can expect moving forward. Today, we'll be looking at data from the second quarter of 2023. So we'll break it down into 4 sections: a general overview, a look into a few B2C sectors, a brief look into B2B, and then we'll end with some predictions for the season ahead. So I would like to kick things off by sharing some key data points about the overall trends we've seen this past quarter. So Jean, if we can get the data up. Thank you. So we'll start by looking at the month-over-month comparison for June and May 2023, and we'll start with North America. So we experienced a decline in sales and traffic, while the conversion rate and average order size showed a positive increase. Shifting our focus to Europe and the UK, very similar to North America, sales and traffic saw a decline, as well as the average order size. The conversion rate displayed a positive trend. Now moving on to the year-to-date comparison. Sales and traffic and conversion rate were all down for North America, with the average order size up by 10%. And for UK and EU, we saw a decline in conversion rate and a slight decline in traffic, while sales and average order size went up. So to start, I would just love to get an overview from you both. As we're looking at these metrics, how should we be thinking right now about e-commerce? And let's start with Brian, and then we can hear from Rob.
Well, thank you, Teresa. We always have to put, the e-commerce numbers into context with the overall economy and retail sales, right? This is a channel in an omni-channel kind of context, and obviously impacted by what's happening in the macro economy. Clearly, June was a very difficult month. It's pretty astonishing to see traffic decline so remarkably. You can see that average order size kind of reflects inflation, and so it kind of balances things out. But there's no question, you can't sugarcoat it as a tough month. But when you put it into context, you need to recognize that, for example, dining and entertainment are up 12% overall in May, likely continued in June. We don't have the June numbers for the US. And travel also is at pre-pandemic levels, and in some cases, some days, well above pre-pandemic levels. So people are traveling and they're spending money on entertainment and dining out. And so we've seen the shift in the overall economy from goods to services, travel, and entertainment. And so you have to kind of put that into context. Now, when you recognize that these numbers are not inflation adjusted, we have to recognize that there's some challenges there. And it probably reflects also a lot of promotional activity to drive demand. So there's some challenges there. I think when we get into the segment numbers, we'll sort of understand, that it varies obviously by market segment, and not everything is down equally. But there's definitely been a shift this year that has impacted retail sales and certainly e-commerce as well.
Yeah, I'll just pile on a little bit. I appreciate the context, Brian, and it's always important to put it there. And that's why I'll probably focus more on the year-over-year data. The US, we're still seeing a leveling off of digital demand. As you brought up, in terms of the average order value or size, people are not buying more product. They're probably getting less for their money. And that is because of increased average selling prices. What I find super interesting is the UK and Europe numbers, which are looking pretty strong. I guess there's probably 2 things to add around that. One is we were, and we continue to do, but the onset of a war on the doorsteps of Europe, which froze the market quite a bit. But I also see that there's a rebounding happening in Europe, thankfully. And the US is probably, let's say, anywhere from 3 to 5 quarters behind. And so I don't see that number popping back up in the US or North America over the next couple of quarters dramatically.
Yeah, I concur with that, Rob. I think if you look at annualizing the European and UK numbers, in 2022, energy prices soared, commodity prices soared. There was obviously a lot of concern about what the Russian invasion of Ukraine would mean for the economy. Energy prices have now started to moderate. Inflation is starting to moderate, although still much higher in the UK and in Europe than in the United States. Now we're annualizing those numbers, so we start to see some improvement year to date, year over year, but still, can be a challenging kind of an economic environment, even so, especially with inflation. And you can see average order size was up 31% year to date in the UK and Europe. That's certainly not just retailers and brands raising prices. That's also reflecting a significant impact of inflation kind of at the core base level. Yeah.
I also want to just get back to, you brought up the point, Brian, around promotions. And I agree with you. Heavy promotions, heavy discount. Many of the brands and retailers I'm talking to are still over inventory. So they're still with the bullwhip effect that so many people felt in the supply chain over the last couple of years, are trying to figure out how to liquidate, how to get rid of that and get really, really ready for a strong position going into the holiday. So I think that's going to be a theme. But I think overall, what I'm hearing when I hear you talk, and certainly we're hearing it from our customers, is this comping issue, right? It's so difficult given what we've gone through over the last couple of years. It's really almost like you have to throw the old playbook out the window.
Yeah, I agree.
Those are some great insights to start us off. Thank you. And now we'll dive deeper into some of the B2C e-commerce sectors, starting with apparel. So we saw a decline across most of our metrics for June year over year, as well as year to date. Sales, traffic, and conversion rates were all down for June and year to date, with the average order size up by 6% in June and just over 5% year to date. Moving on to the grocery, sales was down in June and year to date. Traffic was just slightly down in June and then slightly up year to date. We saw a considerable drop in conversion rates in both June and year to date, and the average order size went up in June as well as year to date. Now, zooming in on luxury, we saw positive growth in sales in June and year to date. Traffic went down in June and year to date, and conversion rates showed steady growth in both June and year to date, while the average order size went down in June and year to date. And to finish up this section, let's look at home furnishing. So sales, traffic, and average order size was down year to date, while the conversion rate was up almost 44%. For home improvement businesses, sales and the conversion rate was down year to date, while traffic grew by 5%, with the average order size also growing by almost 26%. So let's start with apparel. Rob, I would like to ask you, is there anything that strikes you about the trends we saw there, or any larger e-commerce trends in the apparel sector that are top of mind for you?
Yeah. I was looking at the numbers, and it correlates really closely to our shopping index at Salesforce, particularly around the apparel segment. And what I really wanted to do is peel back what it really means by type of apparel. There's so many different types of apparel, from luxury to fashion to active. So just to help provide a little more commentary around it, I looked at some of our numbers to provide that detail I just mentioned. And it was interesting to see luxury, and we'll see that in the luxury category in general, is holding its own. So I'm going to pause and not go into detail on that one. We're also seeing actually strength in active apparel. So people are back out in the world again. Certainly there was a lot of athleisure throughout the pandemic, but now there's a lot of purchasing happening to get fit, be outside, and also for travel, as Brian mentioned, as we're looking at more experiences. Where we did see a dramatic drop, though, and what's really pulling the overall category down is general apparel. So people have bought a lot over the last couple of years, and that's created some softness. And again, some of the excess inventory that probably experiencing in that category. So we're seeing some strengths, like I said, in luxury apparel and active apparel, pulled down by the general apparel.
Yeah,
Right.
just to add on, I think we've got a lot of different factors in there, including sort of cultural factors. Athleisure is now office leisure, right?
Good point.
And I'm even wearing like a kind of a yoga pant here in my office, right? And so I think you see that, post pandemic tastes have changed and people are kind of trading into different things while return to office remains slow. People may be in the office a few days a week now, if they have to be. But many people are not really doing that in the same way that many may have expected. So that's also depressing. And then another thing that Rob mentioned earlier, I think is also a factor, which is we're still seeing assortments kind of flushing through. You can see the decline in conversion rate, which, we see some pretty dramatic swings in those numbers you went through, Teresa, which we'll talk about some of the other categories as well. But with conversion rates down basically 13% year to date, that's pretty remarkable. It shows that people are probably shopping, for items that are on sale, looking for good discounts. So they may be shopping, adding things to cart, not converting, hoping to get a better deal or shopping around. But it also may be that they're just not really finding the things that are really resonating with them from a style perspective. Things actually feel a little stale out there as retailers and brands continue to work through inventory and kind of some conservative choices they were making at the back end of the pandemic, which is really what's largely in retail stores and in the channels today. So I think those are all factors. I think that will start to change at the back half of the year. And I think Q3, we'll talk about it a little bit later. I think in the apparel category, we may hopefully see kind of a swing as some of those inventories get flushed through the system, so to speak. So I think in apparel, we see lots of different factors kind of impacting it. But apparel has never really recovered in a sense from some of the challenges it had during the pandemic. And I think a lot of that's just due to taste and culture as well. And maybe retailers and brands, again, it's lumpy. It differs by retailer and by category. But overall, it's a bit of a challenging sector right now.
Rob, anything you want to add before we jump into grocery?
No, let's do grocery.
Awesome, my favorite topic. So as we went through the numbers for grocery, Brian, I'll start with you. Could you put those numbers into some context for all of us here?
Well, I mean, the grocery numbers are really interesting. You certainly see the impact of inflation, in average order size. And certainly there's been some reporting about CPG brands and private label grocery brands kind of, in a sense, taking some additional margin potentially because they're able to raise prices in this environment. You can kind of see that potentially reflected in some of these numbers. But this is really the first time really since the pandemic began where we see online grocery kind of softening. It's really held steady even post-pandemic. And I think what it comes down to is people trading down. I think it comes down to people trading down, probably making more trips to wholesale clubs and looking for value in the groceries that they're buying. And, it may also reflect some channel shift as well. Although, like I said, online grocery has held its own. So while it, grew dramatically during the pandemic, it never really retrenched following. This is really the first time we've started to see that signal. So it is very interesting. But I think when you put it into the overall context, it's less about people returning to store or changing channels. I think it's more to do with seeking value.
Mm. Rob, what is your take on what the data tells us for grocery?
Yeah, the value piece is critical. So more and more people, no matter what demographic, are going to the dollar stores. They're going to the warehouse stores, which might not show up necessarily in the grocery category. I feel like digital shopping for grocery was a child of the pandemic because it turned so many people on to digital because you didn't have a choice, right? You couldn't go in. Even my mother-in-law, who would always go in because wanted to check out the produce, be it in person, right? And she didn't have a choice. And actually, our data showed going back to 2020, we saw a 40% increase in net new digital shoppers. Like that's huge globally. And that's people that were going online for the first time. There were people that were buying whole new categories that they weren't buying in the past as well. And so there is a little bit of balancing. To Brian's point, though, it's held its own. I just think we're seeing it across different formats. You brought up CG as well. I mean, these are conversations I know, Brian, you're having as well. We were having 15, 20 years ago with the branded manufacturers, like, should I go online? Should I go direct? What's that going to do to my wholesale channel? Same things are happening with CG companies. They're finding more efficient ways around distribution. They're figuring out how to supplement their wholesale model. And so I think, digital groceries here, it's not going anywhere, in large part because of the convenience factor and because of the trust. Now there's trust that actually things will be fresh when I get it at my doorstep or picked up in and around the store. And it's just a question of really a balancing of the various formats. And it speaks to, what the grocery store will look like in the future.
Mm-hmm. Looking at luxury right now and looking at the data for luxury, Brian, could you help us identify what went well in this sector? What were some of the challenges, and what should the brands be thinking about as they look ahead?
Well, I mean, luxury has been, of any of the different segments we track here at Commerce Pulse, it's been the category that has accelerated the most coming out of the pandemic. Certainly during the pandemic, it had a number of really difficult quarters because people weren't traveling, weren't going to events, weren't going to cultural events and concerts and things that tend to drive consumption in luxury, right? People had nowhere to go with these products. So maybe there was a little retail therapy going on, but there wasn't necessarily the things that drive demand. Coming out of the pandemic, we saw this tremendous acceleration. We still see luxury doing well relative to the other categories. However, this is actually a bit of a drop off compared to previous quarters where we were seeing luxury plus 35, plus 40%. Now we see it kind of moderating back. So I think, certainly travel and weddings and things of this nature are driving demand in the luxury sector, and it continues to do well. When we think about the impact of inflation, it's more or less kind of flat though now. So we need to kind of recognize that it's kind of moderating. It's also very interesting to see, sorry, I'm just peeking at the data again. Average order size actually was down pretty dramatically. Conversion rates are up. That shows me that there's quite a lot of promotional activity happening in that segment. So kind of a shift in the luxury market in Q2. Now, recognizing that, assortments will start to refresh again, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the trend for the balance of the year. But it is interesting to see that in late Q2 period, luxury kind of moderated, as I said, came back to earth, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, the word that comes to mind in hearing you talk, Brian, is resilient. I mean, luxury segment has been the most resilient of almost any other of the categories. And though you point out, which I think is important, we are seeing a little bit of moderation. When I looked at the data, we actually were able to segment luxury into 3 categories. And the one that's being pulled down is we'll call aspirational. So it's at the very lower end of luxury. And we're starting to see some holes there, which probably isn't a surprise. People are, as to your point, maybe trading down. And if you're going to the ultra luxury, you might trade down to the middle luxury. But if you're at the aspirational, you're trading out. And so there's a little bit of that. I think generally speaking, if I zoom out for a second and I'd be interested, Brian, in your commentary here, luxury brands, I thought were the most scrappy during the pandemic, and that helped, right? So and you think of luxury being really conservative, they want to control their brand, but they got very active on social. They got very active on live streaming. They turned their associates who couldn't go into the store to become digital concierge, and they were doing clienteling. They had some liberal return policies to make it easier and provide some confidence, which, by the way, I think a lot of companies now are pulling back on those, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I thought I give them a lot of credit for, oftentimes being fast followers to just leaping ahead and taking advantage of digital.
Well, no question that digital sort of got over the hump, so to speak, for a lot of luxury brands who remain somewhat hesitant about e-commerce or digital marketing, feeling like it wasn't necessarily, to their brand, sort of promise and expectations and the experience that they wanted to create, that really shifted. And then I think that's part of what drove some of the acceleration of luxury online. And then obviously there's this notion of a rich session, which means that lower income consumers actually, for example, in the United States, are seeing real wage growth, although it may really be largely keeping up with inflation, and unemployment remains quite low. In the upper income brackets, actually some of the challenges up until recently with the stock market rally were kind of being felt, ironically, in the upper income brackets more so. So we may see that that's somewhat of an impact here. And we have to recognize that in the Q2 numbers, there were still issues around banking crisis and things like this in the news cycle, as well as geopolitical things and concerns. So it may have impacted to some degree luxury. And then international travel is also a big driver of the luxury category, with tourist kind of shopping and so forth. And online now has really embraced that, where people are ordering online for pickup when they get to the foreign city. But nonetheless, with international travel kind of stunted in certain markets, that may have had some impact here. So it's an interesting category to watch. I just think it's notable to see that dramatic acceleration we saw coming out of the pandemic seems to have started to moderate in this category.
Awesome. Let's quickly look at home furnishing. Brian, how would you summarize the situation in this sector?
Well, I would say that, home improvement is largely driven by the housing market. It's people moving, it's people buying homes or moving rental properties and so forth. And the housing market has kind of frozen to some degree due to, the rising, interest rates and the cost of mortgages. And so people are now kind of, more likely to stay in their homes. Now, you would think that would drive home improvement, but during the pandemic, there was a lot of spending on home improvement and the garden and so on. So I think we see home improvement impacted by that overall, and that's reflected in the overall retail numbers, by the way, not just in online. But then I think in online, we're also maybe seeing some channel shift here as well, where people are perhaps more likely to just drive over to the hardware store or the home improvement store versus ordering online for pickup. So that's somewhat of an impact. But again, average order size up 25% and conversion rate down shows that there's price pressure as well in this category.
Rob, your thoughts on home furnishing, home improvement?
I agree with Brian in terms of the shift, because the furniture sector in particular is one that it's important to be able to sit on a couch or sit in a chair or other aspects that really require tactile type of experience. And so we didn't have a choice for a long time. And so many of us were redoing our offices and redoing our kitchens after that. I still need to do that, by the way. My wife.
I just redid mine, Rob. What do you think?
It looks great. I love it. Nicely done. So I think people are going back in the store, but it just speaks to, Brian, what you said just at the very beginning of this conversation. It's not digital versus physical. It's blending that and removing the friction. I think one thing, I know I'm a sample size of one, but as a consumer, I got to appreciate is how much retailers remove friction from the shopping process. And that's something that in home improvement and furnishings certainly helps a lot, where I can see my new couch in the context of my living room, or very quickly and confidently understand what tool or something I need to renovate my house, and do that at home, do the research and discovery, and then be able to pick it up or at least see it in and around the store.
Thanks. So just to conclude this section, I would love to give our audience some practical recommendations as well. So where should the B2C businesses and brands spend their time and investments in terms of technology or e-commerce strategies right now? Let's start with Rob.
Yeah, sure. I think we've alluded to over the course of this conversation, what we've all been through, both personally and professionally over the last couple of years. One of the aspects that we didn't hit upon is the fact that so many people just switched brands. There wasn't a ton of loyalty. A lot of it was driven by availability, like, is the product there? And if not, where else can I get it? Some of it was convenience and actually safety. Can I get it in the comfort of my home and then have it delivered or picked up how I want it? And then, of course, as Brian was alluding to, it's now becoming a lot around value. So there's a lot of shifting is what I'm getting at. Depending on who you listen to or what stat you look at, anywhere from, 50 to even 75% of us switched a brand. And, we're entering a world, or let's face it, we're in a world where acquisition costs are going up. Marketing costs are, in most cases, going down. And so it's, how do you create stickiness with those that switch to your brand? Don't get me wrong. We're always looking to acquire new customers and, feed them through the funnel. But how are you creating stickiness? How are you creating loyalty? How are you increasing the share of wallet? And so that's partly given the rise to loyalty and loyalty programs, but also expanding what services and products that you're providing the consumer. And that's a key aspect of it as well. So there's a lot more I can talk about. Of course, when we talk about technology, you can't have a conversation like this without bringing up the 2-letter acronym of AI, but I'll leave that to Brian and we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But I'll start there. I'd love to hear what Brian has to say.
Well, Rob, I think you hit on something really important, which is, in a sense, loyalty. So, reactivating customers who are either dormant or getting them to purchase, again, inside kind of their demand cycle is really key. So I think leveraging personalization techniques, doing testing, and really focusing on what you can do to optimize the customer file you have, in addition to the customers you hope to acquire over the next few months, will have the greatest impact on your results for this year. Obviously, we're already into July. You're probably, if you're in the retail segment, really thinking about coming up against lockdown around your core tech stack, within a couple of months. So if those projects aren't already in flight, you're probably looking at next year to implement some of those core technologies. Obviously, speed, performance, search that works, digital merchandising strategies that reinforce the lifestyle and the brand and the attributes of the product. Sorry, there seems to be some feedback from my fan. I'll go on mute here in a second. I apologize if people are hearing that. But I'd say, inside your marketing motion, there's absolutely an opportunity still, given where we're at right now, to do more testing, implement agile planning strategies and ways in which you can also adapt quickly as we head toward not only Q3, but into Q4. Get good at that so that you can test and optimize your marketing messages and drive more segmented content out into the channels that will drive repurchase rate. That's really the secret formula. In a sense, it's not so secret, but that's the simplicity of retail, right? Is if you can lower your cost of customer acquisition and get more purchases from repeat customers, you're going to drive profitability. And obviously that's the bottom line everyone has to be focused on right now, as we still are navigating kind of a choppy economic environment. So I'd say focus on personalization. I know that's not exactly what most people would talk about in terms of loyalty, but rather than focusing on a rewards points kind of program, focus on, communicating with your customers in a relevant way, in a contextual way. And I think that's the way you can drive the most kind of positive results through the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think that's critical, as you brought up loyalty as an outcome, Brian, right? It's not necessarily the program per se, although it does give you a little bit as a brand opportunity to understand the consumer more so you can then drive that personalization. But certainly at the end of the day, consumers are trying to solve a problem, and how you're able to do that by personalization, remove the friction, is critical. So I'm glad you kind of honed in on loyalty as an outcome.
Great, thank you for your thoughts. And now we'll just quickly look at some B2B e-commerce trends. So for B2B, sales were up by 41% in June while being slightly down year to date. Traffic was also up in June and decreased year to date. Conversion rates were up by 32% in June with just a slight decrease year to date. And finally, average order size went up in June with almost a 10% decrease year to date. So Brian, can you talk us through what we see in these B2B numbers for this quarter?
Well, B2B, I think is really benefiting a lot from European kind of demand and kind of the economy kind of returning with some vigor in the EU and to some degree in the UK as well. And it's really being driven by return to school, events, concerts, and all of that sort of demand that goes into distribution channels, as well as strength in domestic manufacturing as more and more manufacturers are reshoring in order to mitigate supply chain challenges or geopolitical challenges. And so those are all factoring into what was largely a very strong June. Year to date, down 1%. Again, if we factor in inflation, it's actually a little bit worse than that. So it's still, we're not out of the woods, but it's very interesting and positive to see June so strong at a plus 41%. We see that conversion rates for the year are largely flat, and average order size is down. Again, if you factor in inflation, that's pretty remarkable. That means that there's a lot of price pressure in the B2B distribution and manufacturing sector because they're not able to raise prices to stay abreast of inflation, and in fact have seen some discounting activity. So overall, I'd say B2B is holding strong, has been relatively strong coming out of the post-pandemic period, but there's some lumpiness there, some challenges that I think are concerning. And I think we're still operating in a relatively conservative business environment. So even though there's a lot of positive signals that we're looking at with inflation coming down, core manufacturing numbers holding relatively steady, unemployment obviously very low still. There's still a lot of conservatism in the B2B sector as people look to see what happens next with interest rates, and if in fact we do enter into a recessionary period or potentially are already in one, since we tend to only be able to really tell when we look in the rearview mirror. So I think businesses remain cautious, and that's reflected here in these numbers.
Mm-hmm. Rob, your thoughts on B2B?
Yeah, I don't follow the B2B space as closely as I do B2C, but what I'm hearing from our customers are two things. One is that same B2C buyer is your B2B buyer, meaning all of us who've gotten really comfortable buying online for ourselves are as comfortable buying and doing business online and procuring. So more and more kind of macro picture of the manual, processes are going online and becoming digital. So over time, I agree with Brian, there's some cautiousness in the system. Over time, I feel really bullish about what the market looks like. The second piece is more and more retailers are becoming B2B companies. And I think that's going to fuel a lot of growth, whether it's furniture retailers selling to offices and other businesses, or it's sporting good retailers selling to universities. And a lot of that stuff was done really manually in the past, and that's going to move over and be done in a more automated fashion, digitally, more efficiently as well. So I'm feeling, generally positive about it, despite what we're seeing in these lumps and the more measured buying experiences or measured buying atmosphere that we're in right now.
I think that kind of leads me to a thought and a comment. I think the media tends to focus a lot on stories about return to work, return to store. If we look at the macro, however, e-commerce as a share of overall retail continues to grow. So, actually post-pandemic, we've seen that e-commerce is continuing to grow in terms of its penetration. Now, recognize it's really about omnichannel. So it's not even about counting really necessarily where people are converting at the end of the day. We need to recognize the role of the digital channels in customers making informed decisions, getting inspiration, and even determining their shopping journeys. We tend to focus on the business results of these channels and think about it as sort of a binary and almost a competition between channels. But it is still important to recognize that the convenience of the online channel and the transparency, relatively speaking, of the online channel continues to drive incremental growth, now approaching 16% of overall retail in the US market, for example, continuing to tick up very slowly. And so while retail as a segment overall in the economy is actually fairly challenged right now, and potentially even in a slight recessionary environment in the US market and certainly in the UK market, we see e-commerce continuing to grow in importance. So I think if you're running an e-commerce channel, you got to have that narrative straight. You got to be able to talk about that inside your organization and say, now is not the time to take, investment out of the digital channels. If anything, we need to continue to invest to make sure that we're able to stay hyper competitive in an omni-channel environment, and obviously convert in as frictionless a way possible online and make it as convenient as possible for the consumer. Again, picking up in whichever channel is most convenient for them, and facilitating a great experience for them. So the media tends to focus a lot on return to store, return to office. Not going to get into my spiel as to why I think that's the case right here, but nonetheless, it's important to recognize that actually the data shows e-commerce is growing in penetration, although slower now, obviously, than during early on in the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, amen, first of all, to that. And, another point, given the complexity of the shopping process, or at least how fragmented it is, our research shows that consumers traverse 9 different touch points in any given shopping journey. A lot of the discussion is around attribution. Like last click doesn't necessarily work anymore. And it just actually creates these silos that we've been working so long to try to break down. And so you're right, like given the role of the store associate in digital, well, how are they being incented and how are they being motivated? It needs to be beyond just what sales are happening at the cash wrap, because they're doing so much more to help smooth out that omni-channel experience.
Awesome. Thank you for the insights. So now that we've reflected on Q2, let's shift focus to what lies ahead for the remainder of the year. We mentioned return to work, return to store. What about return to school? So Brian, as we approach back to school season, what are your predictions in terms of e-commerce trends and consumer behavior for this period?
Yeah, I mean, back to school obviously is primarily about, school supplies and apparel. And obviously people also not just going back to school, but refreshing their wardrobes for fall. And it obviously tends to drive a lot of demand as people get their sweaters or jumpers, as those overseas like to call them. I still can't get my head around that. Coats, etc. I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, the apparel sector, I'm looking forward and thinking this may be the quarter we start to see kind of a turning of the corner. I think we'll start to see some fresher assortments. I think consumers are going to be leaning in, and I think back to school will be a good selling season for apparel retailers. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a positive quarter for retail or e-commerce as a whole. However, I think a lot of the things that we've seen impacting Q2 and year to date will persist. So I think apparel will start to turn the corner. But I think overall, we're probably looking at kind of a low single digits kind of growth period. And we'll see, I think, remaining kind of conservatism. When you look at consumer sentiment, it's actually dramatically rebounded in terms of how consumers view the longer term. It's up 25 points so far this year from kind of record lows. So now it's kind of at the midpoint of where we might expect to see on average consumer sentiment. But consumers are still reporting concern over their personal financial situation. So we'll still see, I think some conservative kind of consumer behavior. And in the U.S. market, for example, if student loan payments have to, kind of take a bite again out of consumers' pocketbooks, and certainly inflation and housing costs, and if energy costs rise again, then we might see kind of more of a negative turn. So it's going to be interesting to watch, but right now I'm sort of thinking kind of a low single digit But I do think certain segments of the market, like apparel, may see a nice recovery.
Rob, what about you? Your thoughts on back to school?
Yeah, it's interesting. As we sit here today broadcasting live, I know many will listen to it recorded. We're here at Prime Day. And so to me, it feels like almost the start of back to school. And certainly here in the States, southern states have already started to think about it. And so I think this will be a little bit of an indication. We've seen the last couple of Prime Days in the summer, this halo effect. So retailers took advantage of the buzz. They took advantage of the discounts and the awareness in the dog days of summer. And it created this halo for anybody not named Amazon. And so be an early indicator over the next couple of days what we've seen, and we will be releasing that data throughout the course of this week. I'm with Brian. If I look at the rest of the quarter into the remainder of the year, and it's going to look pretty darn similar, likely, to what we're seeing now for the first half of the year. I'm hoping to see some nice buzz around back to school. I don't think that's necessarily going to pull any holiday sales forward, but to Brian's point, we're back in the world again, travel, back in school in person as we have been, but continued on the handbags and luggage as an example, especially on the luxury side or end of the market as well. So similar to Brian, it's probably going to look similar to what we've seen for the first half of the year. But so I think, as we, sorry, I did pause and now I'm going to talk again. But I think to Brian's point, like the idea of, as we've been talking about retention and loyalty, where, while things in terms of cost of goods sold have normalized a bit, especially where they were container costs as an example, we're still finding ways to do things more efficiently in retail. And I think there's an opportunity there, not just in digital, but in the store as well, as the store is really so critical in the overall digital experience.
Awesome. Thank you for your thoughts. And we're continuing with our prediction section. And today we have a particularly exciting forecast from Salesforce looking into the holiday period. So Rob, I'll start with you. Could you walk us through what you are anticipating for the holiday season in e-commerce this year?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity and platform to share this on this stage, this large stage, and to get Brian's analysis and feedback is so valuable. So I'm excited to turn it over to him soon. Yeah, each year around this time, we put out our holiday predictions because as what was said earlier, this is the time. We're going to be in lockdown around systems and everything's being bought already in the next couple of months. And so how do we get ahead of it? How do we advise the industry? How do we help define what the themes of the year will look like? So we put our stake in the ground around this time, and then in the next 4 to 6 weeks, we'll put out our actual forecast. So let me just run through these really, really quickly. There will be a QR code on the next slide, which we don't have to go to right this moment, but you can take a picture of it and look at the detailed blog on it. But the first prediction, and we alluded to it a moment ago, is around AI. And we're anticipating both generative and predictive AI will influence $194 billion of online sales. A lot of that, by the way, is already being done through predictive. So there may be some switching over to generative and then some net new use cases there. So whether it's marketing and helping with subject lines or email content, or it's in commerce and helping with the product detail page, or it's service and just helping your agents craft that text back to the consumer so it's more on brand and on time. And so you think about this, and a lot of what we based this on was the fact that over 13% of online sales over the last 12 months have already been influenced by predictive AI. The second one is returns. And I know I've had really bad returns experience. Almost everybody I've talked to has, and it really influences whether, for me anyways, I'm going to shop that brand or not. And we see that 21% of holiday online orders are at risk because of a bad returns experience. What makes a good returns experience? Well, it has to be clear. Over 90% of people look for the returns policy, and it helps influence whether they purchase. It must be also easy, like really easy, not putting all the burden on the consumer. And it must be reasonable. Not necessarily free, although that helps. A lot of brands are kind of having the pendulum shift to reining in their policies because they made them very liberal over the pandemic because people didn't have the benefit of going in the store. And we're starting to see a coming back to more reasonable policies, but we got to really balance operational efficiency, associates and how they're handling it, and then the customer experience. The third is around BOPUS, buy online, pick up store, or curbside. We've certainly seen the impact this has had on digital sales. 1 in 3 transactions are buy online, pick up at store after the shipping cutoff date during the holiday season. But what happens is when somebody buys online and then goes into the store to pick it up, there's an extra $28 billion that will be driven this holiday season. But by the way, there's a huge operational implication. How are we giving the space and time to the associates to help fulfill that order? How are we having performance visibility to make sure everybody is actually fulfilling what they need to around pick, pack, and shipping? And how are we providing the right incentives? I mean, essentially associates are becoming not only social media managers, digital concierge agents, but also fulfillment experts. And fourth is around social media. Certainly this is about a marketing mix. But social media, we're seeing having a 10 times greater impact for traffic driving than traditional marketing. So it's finding that right mix, hanging out where the consumers are on their phone. They're on the go again during the holiday season. They're looking at social, but it's also embedding the buy button where the consumers are hanging out, and that's increasingly on social as well. Lastly, and maybe my favorite, although I don't know, I like them all, is around the resale market. I know my 17-year-old goes to thrift shops with his friends and really likes that and sees buying gifts over the holiday. 17%, according to our prediction, of holiday gifts, both online and in store, will be resale. And that's not only to save money, but save the world in terms of, we modeled out 32 billion pounds of waste will be spared from landfills. But it's also a great retention vehicle as well. If somebody's returning something to get a store credit, they will now buy something new. And then somebody aspiring to go to your brand could get in with a gently worn product or certain apparel merchandise. So anyways, I guess if I zoom out here, it's all around, as we talked about before, retention, loyalty, being able to drive that loyalty up, especially as costs are going down. And this is what we anticipate happening over the course of the holiday season.
Awesome, thank you. A lot of great insights there. If we can go back to the slide, and I would just love to get Brian's take on these predictions, as well as something that maybe is not captured there, but you've been thinking about as we're looking into the holiday season.
Well, I got 194 billion. We just have to kind of, again, maybe put that in context. That's probably 17-18% of overall e-commerce. So that already demonstrates a pretty large impact on e-commerce. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my camera just changed for some reason. That's a pretty significant percentage. Certainly, predictive AI, leveraging AI to drive optimization, personalization, search, and so on is something we've been doing as an industry now for really 10, 15 years. But as Rob was talking about, now we're using additional tools. And even though those tools may not be, highly integrated in some cases yet, there's still a lot of activity, happening to, generate more variations of content. What excites me is that that's a propellant for personalization, because that's been holding back many organizations from doing more testing around their content, subject lines, and so on. Now creating content variations is much more feasible, much more cost efficient than ever before. And I think that will play a role at improving how organizations are leveraging their personalization tool sets. And I think, that in a sense kind of helps explain how something that is still so relatively new, like generative AI, can have such a meaningful impact. Certainly, I think returns is a very interesting area. You see a lot of retailers and brands actually moving toward more like final sale policies and things like that. I think we'll actually see some of that activity during the holiday period, where in exchange for a final sale type policy, in other words, no returns, you may get an additional discount. for a retailer, that actually may be a good trade in terms of margin, in order to ensure that, they're kind of protecting their bottom line from what is a very cost-intensive process, right? And certainly in a holiday context, often product is returned and then has to be further liquidated and discounted. So I think we'll see some experimentation around returns, and we'll see more focus on segmenting the customer file around who gets offered what kind of a return process, and potentially more final sale type messaging and business practices. And then I think, just to kind of touch on a couple of the other things, I think BOPUS is clearly a huge expectation now for consumers. And it is one of the pandemic behaviors that has persisted. Now, 60% of consumers are actually looking for curbside or BOPUS pretty actively. They've come to appreciate it. It saves them time. So in other words, making a journey to a store, if I know I'm going to pick up the product I've already bought, that seems like a very reasonable trip to make, even if it's just 10, 15 minutes from my home. Whereas, if you're going shopping, you don't even know if the product you're looking for is there. You're often more reluctant. And that's just a convenience and kind of how we think about our busy lives, especially when we're not running around in our commutes the same way we used to. So I think BOPUS is a key driver. And I think to Rob's point, huge opportunity for cross-sell, upsell, and providing a service opportunity that cements your business into that customer's kind of lifestyle. And makes it easier for them. So I think those are all really important points. And I will echo the resale trend with my young adult children as well. They're gravitating more and more toward resale. Now, we have to recognize that fast fashion and that trend is also happening at the same time. And those are not really easy to reconcile. But nonetheless, I think we'll see higher resale kind of activity this year, to Rob's point. And I think it'll be a trend that is likely to persist because it does connect to the values of so many people as we struggle with climate change and are looking for ways to reduce waste, reduce environmental impact. I think we'll start to see that, even more so in the next few years.
Awesome. Thank you very much for those amazing insights and the conversation today. I hope we provided our audience with valuable insights. And yes, this is where you can access the holiday predictions report from Salesforce. And we do hope we inspired all of you to explore some new opportunities and strategies in Q3 and beyond. So to wrap up, I would like to thank our amazing speakers, Rob and Brian, for sharing their insights with us. If you'd like to hear more from them, you can find them both on LinkedIn or check out Bloomreach and Salesforce websites to learn more about their companies. And we also have some more commerce insights for you. You can check out Commerce Experience podcast that is hosted by our own Brian Walker, as well as the latest edition of Brian's newsletter, Cocktails and Commerce. And lastly, we mentioned AI is a big topic nowadays. So I'd like to invite all of you to join Bloomreach at the Edge Summit this August, where leading experts will explore the transformative power of AI and its impact on the future of commerce. So you can check out theedgesummit.com for more information. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. And as always, we hope to see you next quarter.
One slight plug before we sign off. I will be writing about some additional data that we didn't get an opportunity to share today around the Q2 and year-to-date results and some other segments and so on. So if we didn't cover your part of the market, look for it there on the newsletter, which is free. Love to have you subscribe. And there will be a cocktail with it. Thank you, Rob, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on. I knew it would be a wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing the holiday predictions here. I know we're one of the first places anyway where you've been able to share those. So it was a pleasure to have you on for that. And Teresa, thank you so much for a great job hosting today.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for dialing in.
Bye.